The wind in Sagebrush Ford had teeth, and it was biting hard by late afternoon. This was Colorado territory, 1878, and the high plains offered no apologies. Dust, the color of old rust, whipped up from the main drag, stinging the eyes and coating the split wood sidewalk. It was a dry, mean wind, carrying the smell of alkali and the promise of a deeper cold, down by the bridge over the pitiful, mostly dry creek. The clatter of a single horse crossing the wooden planks sounded sharp, like knuckles cracking in the gray air. Outside the First Presbyterian Church, a thin line of folk stood hunched against the gusts, shoulders drawn up to their ears. This was the Tuesday handout. The church was offering bean soup, thin and mostly broth, but it was hot. It had been a hard year. The drought had choked the pastures green to brown, and the big cattle barons, men like Barton Rusk, were squeezing the smallholders clean until their pips squeaked. She stood apart from the line, her hand gripping the hitching rail outside the livery. Rosalind Avery, though nobody in this town knew that name. She was just a woman, her coat a faded cotton shell that had seen too many winters and offered little warmth. Her hands, red and raw from the cold, were crossed protectively over the high, tight swell of her belly. She was far along, perilously so. She had spent the last hour walking, asking for work, at the mercantile, at the saloon, even at the smithy, offering to scrub floors, wash linens, anything for a place to sleep, a barn loft, a dry corner, anything. The answers were all the same: a quick shake of the head, a nervous look at her condition, and a faster look away. Her eyes held a deep, hunted fear, but she kept her spine straight. She would not beg, not yet. Silas Crowell saw her as he finished his business at the livery. He was tying off a bale of dry clover hay, finalizing a trade. He got a sack of cornmeal for it, barely 10 pounds, but it was food. He was a man worn as thin as his own patched shirt, the elbows gone, the back mended with rough twine, but his shoulders were set solid. He'd seen hard times, was still seeing them, and he was still standing. He watched the woman sway, her knuckles white on the rail as a wave of dizziness took her. She leaned hard, her knees buckling. Silas moved faster than his tired posture suggested. He covered the 6 feet between them in 2 long strides, catching her arm before she hit the dusty boards. His grip was firm, calloused, steadying. She flinched violently, the fear leaping in her eyes, a small gasp escaping her. She expected a blow, or a curse, or to be hauled up and shaken. He just held her elbow until she found her footing, her breath coming in ragged shivers. He looked at the belly, prominent and low, then at her pale, chapped face. His own was weathered, carved by sun and worry. His voice was low, rough from the dust. "You need a roof, ma'am." The question was blunt, not kind, but not cruel. It was a statement of fact. Across the street, inside the warm fug of the Tin Comet Saloon, a pair of teamsters watched through the dirty glass. One nudged the other with his elbow. "That's the one I saw walking in this morning on the East Road. Looked done in then." The other man spat a stream of tobacco juice toward the brass cuspidor. "Runaway wife, I reckon. That's the look. And pregnant, to boot. Lord knows whose get that is." The door of the sheriff's office opened, and Ephraim Pike stepped out, pulling his collar tight. He was a tall man, graying at the temples, who'd seen too much trouble and expected more. He adjusted his hat against the wind and walked toward Silas, his boots heavy on the boards. He nodded a curt greeting. His eyes took in the woman, the belly, and the quiet desperation. "Silas," he said, keeping his voice down so the wind wouldn't carry it. "Just came over the wire from Denver. We got a hard freeze coming in tonight, dropping maybe 20 degrees before midnight. It's gonna be a killer." He paused, looking pointedly at Rose, who tried to shrink away from his official gaze. "It ain't a good time to be taking in strays. You know Rusk's men are about. We had those firebugs last year. Tensions are high. A stranger brings questions." Silas finished securing the cornmeal sack to his saddle. He didn't look at the sheriff. He looked at the sky, which was turning a bruised, sickly purple at the western edge. "A roof is already built, Sheriff," Silas said, his voice flat and final. A hungry belly is what starts fires, not a cold one. He didn't see the man standing in the deep shadow of the alley between the saloon and the assayer's office. Lyle Trencher. He saw everything. He'd been watching Silas, waiting for him to finish his trade. Trencher ran a hand over the rough stubble on his chin, and a thin, cruel smirk touched his lips. The gold from Barton Rusk felt heavy and warm in his pocket. Rusk wanted the water at Willow Spring, the only reliable source in this draw, and Silas Crowell was too damned stubborn to sell. Rusk had told him to apply pressure, make the homesteader see reason. Trencher enjoyed making people see reason. This woman, this complication, might be just the leverage he needed. The ride out to the Crowell homestead was silent. The wind was a physical force, pushing them back for every step they took. Silas gave the woman his horse, the gentle old mare, and he walked alongside, one hand on the bridle, the other holding his hat on his head. It was only 2 miles north of town, but it felt like 20. They arrived as the last light died, leaving the landscape in stark shades of gray and black. The place was barely holding on. The split-rail fencing was down in 3 sections, the poles grayed and broken, but the worst of it was the barn. It was a skeleton, a heap of blackened timbers. The stone foundation cracked and shattered by the heat. It had burned last spring. A fast, vicious fire that had taken his 2 milk cows, his tools, and his winter feed. The smell of char and old ash still hung heavy in the air, a permanent, bitter scar on the property. He led her to the small, 2-room cabin. It was clean, but bare. A rough table, 2 chairs, a cold stove. "It ain't much," he said, pushing the door open against the wind. Rose looked from the burnt-out barn to the small, defiant cabin. She slid down from the horse, her legs shaking. She turned to him, her hands still clutching her coat, her voice hoarse. "I won't be a burden, mister. I'm a hard worker. I can mend. I can cook. I just need to stay until the baby's safely born. Then I'll be on my way. I promise." Silas Crowell looked out at the darkness gathering in the hollow. He thought of the coming freeze, and the wolves, and the men who were worse than wolves. He untied the sack of cornmeal from his saddle and hauled it onto his shoulder. He spoke one word: "Stay." The morning broke brittle and sharp, the world encased in a thin, glittering coat of frost. The freeze had come just as Sheriff Pike had warned. Inside the small cabin, the air was so cold their breath plumed in front of their faces. The hearth fire offered little more than a flicker of psychological comfort. Silas was up before the first gray light, pulling his patched coat on over his shirt. He didn't speak, just nodded toward the stove. It was a small, pot-bellied thing, rusted and inadequate. "Stay by the fire," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'll be back." He went, not to his own empty, blackened barn, but half a mile south, to the Jensen place. The widow Jensen owed him for mending her well pump last month. He returned an hour later, pulling his rickety wagon, which now held a heavy, 4-legged cast-iron cook stove. It was an old model, heavy as sin, but its flat top was what they needed. It took both of them, Silas lifting and Rose steadying, to get the heavy thing into the cabin and settled near the hearth, where the chimney pipe could be angled. The stove's iron legs scraped protesting on the wide plank floor, the sound sharp in the cold silence. While Silas worked, Rose untied the sack of cornmeal. She found a bowl, a spoon. Her hands were stiff, blue-white at the knuckles, but she moved with purpose. By the time Silas had the stovepipe drawing, she had a thin batter mixed, using the last of the water from the bucket. She spooned the batter onto the hot, oiled iron. The cabin filled with a sound that was not the wind, not the groan of old wood, but a sharp, cheerful sizzle. Then, for the first time in what felt like a year, the air in the Crowell homestead filled with the smell of food. Hot corn cakes, the scent rich and warm and golden. It was a smell that spoke of life, and it pushed the lingering cold smell of old ashes back out the door. They ate, standing by the stove, soaking up its radiating heat. They didn't speak of the future. They didn't speak of the past. They just ate. Later that morning, a wagon rattled into the yard. Silas looked up, his hand instinctively moving toward the axe handle by the door, his posture tense. Rose shrank back from the small window. "It's just Tamsin," Silas said, relaxing his shoulders. "Tamsin North, the midwife." A woman, built as solid as an oak stump, climbed down from the wagon seat. She carried a worn leather bag. Tamsin North had delivered half the children in this county and buried the other half. Her face was a map of hard decisions, and her eyes missed nothing. She stumped into the cabin, bringing a blast of cold air and the scent of sagebrush with her. "Heard you pulled a stray," she said, her voice like gravel. She didn't wait for an introduction, just pointed a thick finger at Rose. "You sit. Let me look at you." Rose submitted to the examination. Tamsin's hands were rough, but surprisingly gentle. She pressed and listened and hummed. Finally, she straightened up, satisfied. "You're thin," Tamsin declared, snapping her bag shut. "But the babe's riding high and strong. You've got good hips, that's a mercy. But you're worn to a frazzle. This high plains air is hard on the lungs and harder on a body carrying new life." She fixed Silas with a stare. "She needs rest. No heavy work, no lifting, no scrubbing. You understand me. Crowell, and she needs food. Better than that." She gestured to the leftover corn cakes. She turned back to Rose, her expression softening just a fraction. "I'll send over some sage tea for the sleeping. It'll calm your nerves. You're safe enough here. Silas Crowell's stubborn, but he's not mean, and he's not foolish." She gave Rose one last look. "You're a long way from home, child. Try to rest in this one." After she left, the silence in the cabin felt different. It was heavier, laced with the unasked questions Tamsin's visit had raised. Rose watched Silas. He sat on the floor, his back against the wall, working on a broken saddle. The leather was dry and cracked, the stitching rotted. He was mending it with a thin, waxed strand of sisal twine and a curved awl. He worked slowly, his large, calloused hands surprisingly precise. He punched each hole with care, pulled each stitch tight and even. Every knot was flush. Poverty was a fact of his life. She saw, but sloppiness was a choice, and he had not chosen it. His mending was like his posture poor, but clean. She felt a sudden sharp need to explain herself, to fill the quiet with apologies. "Mr. Crowell," she began, her voice small. About my situation, I feel I should tell you." He didn't look up from his work. He just pulled a stitch tight. "We don't need the past in this cabin, ma'am. It takes up too much room as it is." She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. The relief was so strong, it made her dizzy. "Rose," she said. "You can call me Rose." He paused his work, looked at her for a moment, and gave a single, short nod. "Silas." The rule was set. No questions asked. Each would keep their own silence. At noon, a small crisis arose. One of his few remaining hens, a scrawny, pale-combed bird, was sitting listless in the corner of the small coop, her handful of new-hatched chicks peeping weakly around her, cold and ignored. Silas went to look, his face set in the familiar lines of resignation. It was the way of things. The cold was claiming them. It was just another loss. Rose followed him. She looked at the hen, then at the chicks. "It's the croup," she said. "She's sick, but the babies are just cold and hungry." Before he could move, she went back to the cabin. She returned with a cup of warm water and a pinch of salt. She sat on the frozen ground, heedless of Tamsin's warning, and gathered the tiny, peeping birds into her apron, one by one. She dipped her finger in the salt water and touched it to their tiny beaks, gently forcing them open, making them drink. It was slow, tedious work. Her fingers were red and stiff, but she was patient, murmuring to the small creatures. Silas watched her, his arms crossed, saying nothing. He watched this woman, who looked as fragile as the chicks themselves, fight the cold with a teaspoon of salt and a deep, quiet stubbornness. After an hour, the chicks were vigorous, peeping loudly and scrambling over her lap. She got the mother hen to drink, too, and tucked the birds into a small box with a warm rag near the stove. She stood up, brushing straw from her coat. and looked at Silas, almost shyly. He was looking at her, and the hard-weathered bark of his face cracked. It was not a grin, not a full smile. It was just a small, upward turn of one side of his mouth, a brief glint of warmth in his gray eyes. It was the first time, and it changed the set of his entire face. That afternoon, Rose turned her attention to the small, lean-to shed attached to the back of the cabin. It was where Silas stored his grain, but it was also where he had put her bedroll. It was cold, dusty, and smelled of mice. She worked all afternoon. She swept the floor, scrubbed the one small, grimy window pane, and stacked the grain sacks neatly against the far wall. The room had a single, rough-hewn door that separated it from the main cabin. It was an old, salvaged thing, painted a bright blue ages ago, now flaking and scarred. When she was done, the space was clean. It was still a shed, but it was her space. From the small, worn bundle of her possessions, she took one thing, a 3-inch scrap of faded burgundy ribbon. She tied it to the rusty nail on the back of the blue door. It was a small, defiant touch of color in the gray, brown world. A tiny, cheap thing, but it was an anchor. Night fell again, harder this time. The wind returned, howling down from the peaks, and the cabin groaned under the assault. The old timbers popped and creaked, as if the cold itself was trying to pull the house apart. Silas laid his bedroll near the new cook stove, where the last of the heat radiated. Rose retreated to her small room, shutting the peeling blue door. The blackness in the shed was absolute. The wind sounded louder in there, the walls thinner. She lay under the blankets, her body tight, listening to the house settle, listening to the dark. Then she saw a thin line of light appear under the door. She heard Silas move, the soft scuff of his boots on the plank floor. He set something down, his movements quiet. He had lit the hurricane lamp. He had turned the wick down low, so it cast only a small, steady, golden glow. He placed it on the floor in the main room, right outside her door. It was not a question. It was not an intrusion. It was a guard. It was a small, steady light against the vast, howling dark. It was the promise that she was not alone in the house. Rose closed her eyes, and for the first time in a month, she slept without fear. Miles away, in the warmth of the tin comet, Barton Rusk swirled the whiskey in his glass. Lyle Trencher stood opposite him, cap in hand. "A woman," Rusk said, his voice a soft, dangerous purr. "A pregnant woman, and he just took her in." "That's right, Mr. Rusk. Like a stray pup. Midwife Tamsin North was out there today. Confirmed it." Rusk looked into his whiskey. Silas Crowell's stubbornness over the Willow Spring water was costing him time and money. He'd thought to simply starve him out, buy him out for pennies on the dollar. But the man just wouldn't break. A pregnant woman. Rusk mused. That changes the angle. A man with dependents is a man with weaknesses. There are laws, public decency laws. We could make a claim that he's running a disorderly house, that she's an unfit mother, and he's complicit. He smiled, a thin, bloodless expression. A man with a reputation to protect might be more reasonable about a land sale. He slid 2 gold coins across the table. Lyle's hand covered them instantly. "I don't want him comfortable," Rusk said. "I want him to remember that his little patch of dirt is only his because I allow it. Go out there. Don't burn him out. Not yet. We need the leverage of the woman. Just remind him. Remind him what happens when he holds on to things I want. Remind him of last year's fire." Lyle Trencher's grin was all teeth. "A pleasure, Mr. Rusk. I'll make sure he gets the message." A few weeks settled over the homestead. They passed in a rhythm of shared, silent labor, a truce of necessity. The cold held, a solid, tangible thing that seeped through the chinked logs of the cabin. Rose had regained some strength, the sharp, hollow look in her cheeks softening. She had taken over the cooking, her presence turning the bare cabin into something that, if not warm, was at least alive. One afternoon, while Silas was miles away checking the trap lines he hoped would add meat to their meager larder, Rose found herself by the ruins of the barn. The wind was low, and the air was still. She had been sweeping the yard, an endless, thankless task against the Colorado dust, and she had moved closer to the blackened skeleton of the structure than ever before. The smell of char was still sharp, a bitter perfume that never left the property. She reached out and touched one of the foundation stones, cold and cracked. Then she picked up a piece of timber. It was heavy, soaked with the memory of the fire, but as she held it, another scent rose up beneath the ash. It was not the clean smell of burnt pine. It was something else, something oily, sharp, and chemical. She scraped at the blackened surface with her fingernail. A gummy, resinous tar came away. She lifted her finger to her nose. Turpentine, pine oil. Her blood ran cold. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather. A stray spark from a lantern. A bolt of lightning. That was an accident. Kerosene for lamps was common, but turpentine, that was an accelerant. It was bought with a purpose. It was the tool of a man who meant to burn something down fast and sure, leaving no chance for it to be saved. This was no accident. This was a calculated, deliberate act of destruction. She dropped the wood as if it were a hot coal. That evening, Silas returned from town, his face set in a hard, dangerous quiet. He'd traded his few rabbit pelts not for food, but for shot, and he carried a single envelope. He slapped it down on the rough-hewn table. "This was waiting for me at the postmaster's office," he said. Rose picked it up. It was a formal-looking document, a demand for payment. It claimed Silas Crowell was delinquent on a loan for $300 for the purchase of fencing wire and posts. Dated 6 months prior. "I never took this loan," Silas said, his voice a low growl. "I cut my own posts, and I mended my wire with sisal. I haven't seen $300 in one place in my life." Rose looked closer. The paper was expensive, the type new, but the seal at the bottom was wrong. It wasn't the seal of the county court or the bank in Denver. It was a fancy, pressed wax initial, a B and an R twisted together like a pair of snakes. "Barton Rusk," she whispered. "He's not just sending his dogs to bark anymore," Silas said, staring into the cold hearth. "He's building a cage, a paper one. He'll get a judge he owns to grant him a lien on this homestead. He'll force a sale to cover a debt that never existed. And he'll get the Willow Spring for the cost of a lying piece of paper." The cold, methodical cruelty of it settled in the room, heavier than the frost. They were fighting a man who didn't need matches when he could use the law as a weapon. A few days later, Rose needed more mending thread. The last of her small supply was gone. Silas pressed 2 bits into her palm. "Get what you need from Feeney's, and keep your head down. Don't linger." The walk to town was long, the air thin. Sagebrush Ford was busy. Teamsters and loggers, down from the high camps for supplies, crowded the boardwalk. As Rose approached Feeney's general store, she had to pass the bat-wing doors of the Tin Comet. They burst open, and a cloud of hot, sour air, smelling of stale beer and unwashed men, billowed out, followed by a roar of laughter. A group of rough-cut men stood outside, stretching and smoking. One, a big man in a red flannel shirt, was holding court, his voice loud. "So I told Rusk's man, Trencher, that I'd do the next job for half what he paid the last fella," the logger bragged. "The one they hired to light up that stubborn homesteader's barn last spring, the fancy one with the silver ring." Another man spat. "You mean that gambler, the one who thought he was a gunslick, wore that silver ace of spades on his trigger finger like he was somebody?" Rose froze. She was in the shadow of the mercantile overhang, just 10 feet away. Her heart felt as if it had stopped. A silver spade ring. The image leaped into her mind, sharp, clear, and sickening. A hand, flashing silver, sliding across a card table. A hand, clenched into a fist. She ducked into Feeney's store, her breath coming short. The little bell above the door chimed, a sound far too cheerful. Old man Feeney was behind the counter, polishing his spectacles. He was a small, fussy man who had been there for 30 years. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, squinting at her. "Ah, the new resident at the Crowell place, needing something." "Thread," Rose managed to say, her voice sounding distant. "Just black thread, if you please." As he shuffled to the cabinet, Rose leaned against the counter, trying to stop the world from tilting. Pine oil, a silver spade ring. The pieces were connecting, forming a picture she did not want to see. That fire at the Crowell place," she said, forcing her voice to be steady. Conversational. "It was a terrible thing. Such an accident." Feeney turned, the spool of thread in his hand. He gave a short, dry snort. "Accident wasn't no accident, ma'am, not by a long chalk. Had a fella in here the day before, a stranger, flashy sort. Bought 2 full gallons of turpentine. Said he was refinishing furniture." Feeney tapped the side of his nose. "In a tent, in April. I wasn't born yesterday." Rose's heart was a drum against her ribs. You remember him?" "Don't remember faces like I used to," Feeney admitted. "But I remember the order. Turpentine ain't cheap, and 2 gallons is a sight. Had him sign the supply ledger for it. Store policy on chemicals and large credit. He paid in gold, but I made him sign all the same." Rose put her hand on her stomach, feigning a cramp. "My goodness, Silas, he's looking to rebuild. He'll need supplies. He'll need to know what things cost. That man, could I see the entry so I can make a list for Silas to know what to buy?" It was a flimsy excuse, but Feeney saw only a pregnant woman trying to be helpful to her benefactor. "Why, surely," he said, pleased. "Right neighborly of you." He pulled a massive, leather-bound ledger from under the counter and opened it, wetting his thumb to turn the dusty pages. "Was back in April, near the 14th, I reckon. Ah, here we are." He turned the book toward her and pointed a gnarled finger. "There, 2 gallons pine oil, 1 box Lucifer matches. And there's his signature." Rose leaned over. The shop was suddenly too hot. The smell of cinnamon and cured leather overwhelming. She read the signature. It was an arrogant, sharp scrawl, letters slashed onto the page. C. Morgan. The blood left her face so fast she grabbed the counter to keep from falling. Her hand, the one not clutching the thread, began to shake. A fine, violent tremor she couldn't stop. She curled her fingers into her palm, digging her nails in, hiding the weakness in the folds of her worn coat. Cass Morgan, her husband, the man she had fled 1,000 miles to escape, the man who wore a silver spade on his right hand. Odd fella. Feeney was rambling, oblivious. "Paid and left. Never saw him before. Never saw him since. That'll be 2 bits for the thread, ma'am." She fumbled with the coins, her hand still shaking. She dropped one, and it rolled on the floor. I'm sorry. "You look peaked, ma'am," Feeney said, his tone shifting to concern. "It's the altitude, and your condition. You best get back." She nodded, unable to speak. She snatched the thread and fled the store, the bell jangling mockingly behind her. She ran the first 100 yards, stumbling in the rutted road, the secret choking her. Cass was here, or he had been. He was the firebug. He was the one who had burned Silas's barn, destroyed his livelihood. And Rusk had paid him, the man whose charity she was living on, the man who had given her a roof and treated her with quiet respect, was the victim of the man who still legally owned her. When the homestead came into view, she saw it, nailed to the gatepost, flapping in the rising wind, was a white scrap of paper. It wasn't just paper. It was a page torn from a ledger, just like the one in Feeney's store. A large skinning knife, the blade black and ominous, had been driven through the paper and deep into the wood. Silas was already there, standing motionless, staring at it. He had seen it from the field. Rose walked toward him, her legs feeling like water. The message was scrawled in charcoal, the letters crude and angry. "Sell the water. Keep your life." Silas said nothing. He gripped the handle of the knife and pulled, working it free from the tough wood. He tested the edge with his thumb, his eyes cold and flat. Lyle Trencher's knife. He read the note again, his face a mask of stone. Then, slowly, he crumpled the paper in his fist. He turned and saw her standing there, her face as white as the note. He mistook her terror for fear of the threat. "Rusk's man," he said, his voice hard. "Just trying to scare us." Rose's lips parted. The words were on her tongue. "I know who did this. I know the man who burned your barn. His name is Cass Morgan. He is my husband." But the words died. If she spoke, what would he do? He was a hard man, but a just one. He would tell her to leave. He would have to. He could not, would not, harbor the wife of his greatest enemy, and she would be out in the cold. With the baby coming, with Cass and Rusk's men somewhere in the hills, she would be currency, a tool, a piece of property to be reclaimed. The baby kicked, a sharp, sudden reminder of the life she was carrying. The secret settled in her chest, a lead weight. It was a stone in her shoe, a shard of glass she would have to walk on with every step. Silas looked past her, toward the gurgling, life-giving sound of the willow spring. "He wants the water," he said, almost to himself. "Water is the only thing that matters. Selling it? That's just a slower way to die." He met her gaze, his own filled with a resolve that was as hard and unyielding as the mountains. "We don't sell." He walked past her into the cabin, leaving her alone with the wind, the crumpled threat in his hand. Rose stood by the violated gate, a liar by omission, trapped between the man who had saved her and the man who had ruined them both. The threat did not wait long to curdle the air. It came 3 nights later, riding on the back of a storm that clawed its way over the high peaks. The wind didn't just howl, it shrieked, a high, thin sound that plucked at the roof and hammered against the lone chimney. The sky was a bruised, restless black, split every few minutes by jagged forks of white-blue lightning. Rain followed, not as a cleansing shower, but as a hard, driving volley of ice-cold needles. Inside the cabin, the new cook stove was a small, glowing heart against the oppressive cold. Silas sat at the table, mending a piece of harness by the low light of the hurricane lamp. His movements were steady, methodical. He refused to give the storm his fear. Rose sat on the small stool, her hands wrapped around a tin mug of hot water, her back to the peeling blue door of her room. The child was restless, turning inside her, as if it, too, could sense the fury outside. The silence between them was no longer the empty, awkward quiet of strangers. It had become a shared space, a worn and familiar thing. But tonight, it was stretched thin. Rose's secret. The name C. Morgan felt like a physical weight in her throat. Every time the wind hit the cabin, she flinched, imagining a hand on the latch, a silver-ringed hand. Then, a new sound cut through the storm. It was not the wind, and it was not the thunder. It was a low, deep rumble, like the earth itself was unzipping. It was the sound of chaos, a sound of mass panic, underscored by something else, a high, human yell, sharp with malice. Silas was on his feet before the sound had fully registered. The harness dropped from his hand. His face, illuminated by the lamp, was suddenly stripped of all its weary calm. It was a mask of grim, cold fury. "What is it?" Rose whispered, her hand flying to her throat. "Cattle," he said, his voice a low growl. He grabbed his heavy oilcloth slicker from the peg by the door. "They've fired the herd." He ripped the door open. The wind and rain blasted in, extinguishing the lamp in an instant, plunging the room into a chaos of noise and darkness. Rose cried out, stumbling back. Through the open door, in the next flash of lightning, she saw it, a living sea of black, heaving shapes, a nightmare of horns and rolling eyes. His small herd, barely 24 head, was stampeding, but they were not alone. Mingled with them were 100 more. Rusk's cattle, driven from the high pasture and aimed directly at the homestead. And arcing through the darkness, like terrible, fiery comets, were the firebrands. Rags soaked in oil, lit and thrown from horseback, landing in the wet grass, hissing and flaring. The men, just shadows on horseback, were yelling, whipping the herd into a frenzy. "Get back!" Silas roared at her. Stay inside, bar the door. He plunged into the rain, a single, dark figure against the oncoming tide of panic. He was one man, on foot, trying to turn a stampede. He ran, not at the head, but at the flank, trying to angle them away from the fragile cabin, away from the weak, broken line of the fence. Rose slammed the door, her hands shaking so violently she could barely find the wooden bar. She dropped it into place. The cabin was a small, dark box, and the sound of the hooves was everywhere, shaking the very floorboards. She could feel the impacts through the soles of her shoes. She was alone in the dark, paralyzed. This was it. This was the end of the small, safe world they had built. They were being overrun. Then she heard a sound, a sharp crack, like a rifle shot, followed by a human cry of pain. Silas. The paralysis broke. It shattered, replaced by a surge of hot, bright adrenaline that was stronger than her fear, stronger than her exhaustion. She would not hide. She would not be the cowering victim in the dark. She ripped the bar from the door and threw it open again. The storm and the chaos rushed in. In the frantic, flickering light of the firebrands, she saw Silas. He was on the ground, 20 yards from the cabin. A huge steer, blinded by rain and fire, had cut him off, knocking him down into the mud. He was trying to crawl away, but the animal was turning, its head low, its horns like polished daggers. Rose looked frantically around. There was no one, just the herd, the rain, and the distant, circling shadows of the riders. But there was the bell. By the cabin door, a heavy iron triangle hung from a wooden post. It was the old dinner bell. The alarm bell, the call for help in a land where your nearest neighbor was a mile away. She grabbed the small iron striker. She began to hammer it, ringing it with a frantic, desperate rhythm, a wild clangor that cut through the noise of the storm. Help! 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 She screamed the word with every strike. The sound was thin, but it was her sound. From the high ground, a mile to the east, on the ridge known as Chalk Bluff, Lyle Trencher watched. He was dry under his long slicker. He'd done his job. The herd was scattered. Crowell's fences would be flattened. And the man himself was probably crippled or dead. It was a good night's work. As he turned his horse to leave, a jagged streak of lightning lit the entire valley for one long second. Rose, still hammering the bell, looked up, her eyes scanning the ridges, searching for the source of this nightmare. In that flash of white light, she saw him. A lone rider, silhouetted against the sky on Chalk Bluff. He was too far to see his face, but she saw the rain glint off his long, dark coat. And as he turned, something on his chest or his waist flashed, a bright, hard point of reflected silver. The rider disappeared into the blackness. The steer was closing on Silas. Rose dropped the striker. Her eyes darted, finding the heavy canvas tarp Silas kept folded by the woodpile. It was stiff, heavy with water. She grabbed it, her pregnant belly a cumbersome weight, and she ran. She ran into the mud, into the herd, screaming, Get back, Haya!" She ran directly at the head of the massive, confused steer. Silas shouted her name, a roar of pure terror. "Rose, no!" She was 10 feet from it. The beast's eyes were white, rolling in panic. It lowered its head to charge. Rose, using her last ounce of strength, unfurled the tarp. She shook it open, a solid, 10-foot wall of flapping canvas. She held it high, making herself a monster, a huge, dark, flapping thing in the heart of the storm. The steer, already panicked by fire and sound, was not prepared for this. It met a solid wall of flapping, threatening canvas. It bellowed, a sound of terror, and jammed its legs into the mud. Skidding to a halt, it turned, violently, crashing into the steer beside it, and began to run the other way, back toward the open range. The lead animals followed, the panic shifting, the entire herd turning on itself, flowing away from the terrifying, flapping thing by the cabin. Just as the herd turned, 2 riders burst into the yard, lanterns swinging. It was Sheriff Pike and the oldest Jensen boy, drawn by the bell. They saw the end of it, the mud-covered, staggering homesteader, the pregnant woman, standing her ground with a canvas tarp, trembling but upright, and the last of the herd thundering away into the darkness. They managed to get the gate on the small corral shut, saving a handful of Silas's cattle. The rest were gone, scattered for miles. Silas was bruised, his shoulders screaming in pain, mud caked from head to toe, but he was alive. He walked toward Rose, who was still clutching the tarp, her knuckles white. He stopped in front of her. The rain was easing, and in the light of the sheriff's lantern, he just looked at her. He said nothing. He didn't have to. His eyes, dark with pain and exhaustion and a new, fierce gratitude, said it all. Sheriff Pike spat. That was Lyle Trencher's work, or Rusk's. Damn them both. You all right? Silas. I am, Silas said, his voice raw, his gaze still on Rose. Pike looked at her, too. He took off his hat, slicking back his wet hair. Ma'am, he said, and the word was full of a new respect. You got more grit than any 3 men I know. The story was all over Sagebrush Ford by the next afternoon. The gossip about the runaway wife died instantly. She was Crowell's woman, the one who had faced down a stampede to save him. She had grit. Barton Rusk heard it, and he was furious. The stampede had failed to break Crowell, and it had made the woman a local hero. He changed tactics. He rode out to the homestead 2 days later, not with riders, but with his lawyer. He found Silas mending the broken fence, his arm in a sling. Crowell, Rusk said, his voice slick and pleasant. He didn't dismount from his fine black horse. A terrible business. That storm. You lost most of your stock. I hear you're ruined. You're a man with a woman and a child on the way. You can't protect them. You can't even protect yourself. Silas just kept wrapping the wire, his one good hand slow and steady. I'm a generous man, Rusk continued, loud enough for Rose, who was watching from the cabin window. To hear, I'll give you $100, cash, for this whole miserable patch of dirt, $100. It's more than it's worth, but I'll consider it charity. Take the money and the woman, and be gone by sundown. Silas slowly, painfully, finished his knot. He stood up, wincing. He looked up at the wealthy man on the horse. He looked at the cabin, where Rose was watching. He looked at the willow spring, gurgling in the draw. No, he said. Rusk's face purpled. You're a fool. I will have this land. No, Silas said again. He turned his back on Rusk and walked, slowly but steadily, back to his own cabin. That night, the silence was different again. It was charged. They had faced death together. He had been offered a way out, a way to abandon her in the land, and he had refused. Rose had to break the rule. She had to. The flash of silver she had seen on the ridge, real or imagined, was burned into her mind. It connected to the logger's story, to the ring, to the name in Feeney's ledger. Silas, she said, her voice shaking. She was standing by the stove, twisting a rag in her hands. He looked up from where he was oiling his rifle. The man the logger spoke of, she stammered. The one in the tin comet. The one who wore the silver ring, the spade. He waited, his eyes unreadable. He is a man from my past. She forced the words out. The lie was only a half-truth. He's the man I ran from. He's a gambler and a monster. He ruined me, and I think he's here. I think he's the one who burned your barn. She stood there, trembling. Having confessed, she had tied her own monstrous past to his. She had brought this trouble to his door. She waited for the anger, for the disgust. She waited for him to tell her to leave. Silas laid the rifle down. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the darkness for a long time. The only sound was the low hiss of the stove. Finally, he turned to her. His face was hard, but his eyes were not angry. They were just tired. It's not your fault, Rose, he said, his voice quiet. A match doesn't have a fault. The fault lies with the hand holding the match. He paused, his gaze finding hers. You're safe here. This is your home. We hold it together. The attack and their survival changed the air. The threat was no longer a distant shadow on a ridge. It was a physical force they had both faced and turned back. The shared danger and the shared victory had burned away the last of their necessary distance. They were no longer just a man and a woman sharing a roof. They were a partnership, forged in mud and desperation. The stampede had done its work. The small, rickety chicken coop was gone, trampled flat. The lean-to where Silas had stored his grain was heavily damaged. One wall caved in. They needed to rebuild, fast. Not the great charred skeleton of the barn that was a wound too deep and expensive to heal, but a small, defensible structure. A place for the mare, Juniper, and the few remaining chickens. Silas's arm was still in a sling, his shoulder a mass of deep purple bruising. He could not lift, he could only direct, and work with one hand. "By the creek," he said, his voice strained from the pain. "The willows and cottonwoods. The high water last spring washed a dozen good poles onto the bank. We can drag them here." It was slow, agonizing work. He used his good arm, and she used all the strength her changing body possessed. They became a strange, lurching, three-armed, two-backed creature. He would loop the rope, and she would pull, walking backward, her heels digging into the hard soil. To raise the main posts, they had to work in perfect, breathless rhythm. He would brace the base with his boot, his good hand guiding the wood, and she would push, her hands flat, her breath coming in sharp gasps. "Now," he said, and she pushed. The poles slid into the hole he dug. They had to lift the crossbeam together. It was heavy, slick with river mud. "Hold it steady," he grunted, his face pale with the effort. He took the high end, she took the low. Their hands brushed, his calloused and rough, hers chapped but strong. The contact was electric, a jolt of simple, shared humanity. Their breathing synchronized, a harsh huff of effort as they lifted the beam and slotted it into place. They stood back, both covered in mud and sweat, panting. A small, three-sided shed. It was ugly, it was rough, but it was standing. Rose looked at his hand, then at hers, both resting on the new wood. She met his gaze, and for the first time, she did not look away, and neither did he. It was a look of profound, shared accomplishment. They had built something new out of the scraps. That evening, the ache of the day's labor settled into their bones. The cabin was quiet, the only sound the low hiss of the stove and the click of Rose's needle. Silas was oiling the old saddle he'd mended, his one good hand working the wax into the stiff leather, trying to restore its life. Rose sat by the lamp. She had taken a square of thick, brown wool salvaged from an old horse blanket and was working on it with the black thread she had bought at Feeney's. Silas watched her out of the corner of his eye. He had seen her sewing, mending his shirts, patching the worn knees of his denims. But this was different. This was not mending. This was a creation. Her stitches were small, precise, and deliberate. She was forming letters. He watched as the shapes emerged: a C, then an R, an O. She was embroidering, her head bent in concentration, the lamplight catching the soft curve of her cheek. He stopped his work. The cabin was absolutely still, save for the pull click of the needle passing through the tough wool. She finished the last letter, bit the thread, and held it up. Crowell. It was stitched, clear and plain. In the corner of the small blanket, a name, his name, a name for a child that was not his, stitched by a woman who was not his wife. It was a statement, a claim, and a profound, unspoken thank you. It was a stitch that bound the child, and her, to this place, to him. Silas swallowed. The sound was loud in the quiet room. He could not find a single word. He just looked at the name, then at her. He gave one, sharp, acknowledging nod. It was enough. Rose folded the blanket, a small, secret smile touching her lips, and put it away. As his shoulder healed, Silas grew more anxious. Rusk was quiet, but it was the quiet of a snake coiling. "You need to be able to move," he told her one morning, his voice abrupt. "If trouble comes, if I'm not here, you can't just ring the bell and hope." He led the old mare, Juniper, from the new shed. The horse was a gentle, gray-muzzled creature, patient and kind. You rode her in, he said, but you'll ride her out. Silas, I'm not sure. My balance. The horse knows, he said. Just trust her, and trust me. He cupped his good hand for her boot. She hesitated, then placed her foot in his palm, and he lifted her onto the saddle. The movement was surprisingly gentle. He stood at Juniper's head, his hand on the bridle, talking in a low, soothing voice. He spoke as much to the woman as to the horse. Easy, now. Just feel her walk. She knows this land. Just let her carry you. You are not a burden. You're just riding. He walked them around the corral, then out into the open pasture by the spring. The air was clear, the sun warm for the first time in months. The first hints of green were fuzzing the banks of the willow spring. Rose's hands, at first a white-knuckled grip on the pommel, began to relax. She felt the steady, rolling gait of the horse, the solid life beneath her. Let her trot, Silas said, stepping back. Just a light squeeze. Rose did. Juniper moved into a slow, rocking trot. The movement, the freedom, the crisp wind pulling strands of hair from her bun and whipping them across her face. It was intoxicating. After months of being trapped, heavy, and hunted, she felt, for one brief second, light. A sound bubbled up from her chest. It was a surprise. First a gasp, then a small giggle, and then a full, clear, unrestrained laugh. It was a sound that had not been heard in this valley for a very long time. Silas stood frozen by the fence post, stunned. He had never heard her laugh. It was a sound like clear water, bright and strong. It cut through all the dust, all the char, all the fear. He felt his own face crack into that rare, one-sided smile. That sound, he thought, was worth fighting for. That sound was worth dying for. When Tamsin North returned, she stomped onto the porch, her bag in hand, and stopped. She looked at the new shed. She looked at the clean-swept yard. She looked at Rose, who was glowing from the ride. Well, the midwife grunted, a rare flicker of approval in her eyes. You've been busy. Looks less like a bachelor's pigsty and more like a home. Good. Nesting is good. She shooed Silas out of the cabin. Go on. Crowell. This is woman's business. Go count your fence posts. She had Rose lie down on the cot in the small, clean room with the peeling blue door. Silas did not go to the fence posts. He stood in the main room, just outside her closed door, his hat in his hands. He pretended to check the stovepipe, but he was stock still, listening. He heard the murmur of Tamsin's voice, then Rose's, then a different sound. Tamsin was humming. Ah, Tamsin said, her voice clear. There you are. She had placed a small, hollowed-out wooden tube against Rose's abdomen, her ear pressed to the other end. Listen, she said, shifting. Silas heard a faint, muffled thump, 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 astonishingly fast. That, Tamsin declared, is a good strong heart, beating like a hummingbird's wing. This one's a fighter, just like its mother. Silas heard a small, sharp intake of breath from Rose, a sound that was half sob, half joy, outside the door. Silas leaned his head against the rough wood frame, his eyes squeezed shut. He was twisting the brim of his hat in his hands, his knuckles bone white. It was real, a real living thing, a hummingbird's heart, beating in his cabin, in his care. He let out a breath he felt he had been holding since the day she arrived. That evening, the mood was soft, the air was cool, but the biting edge of winter was gone. They sat on the top step of the porch, a comfortable, silent foot of space between them. They were drinking oak tea, a bitter, hot brew Silas made from boiled acorn hulls and willow bark. It was what they had. He was staring out at the hollow, the place where he dreamed of his orchard. He was quiet for a long time. This place, he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. Before the fire, I had a plan. I wasn't always just holding on. Rose waited, watching his profile in the dusk. I sent away for them, he said, from a catalog in Missouri. 20 apple saplings, golden russets and wine saps, meant to plant them right there. He motioned with his chin toward the fertile draw, fed by the spring. This wasn't meant to be cattle land. It was meant to be an orchard, the willow spring. It would have been perfect. I dreamed of the smell of the blossoms, something clean, something that just grew. He spoke of the dream as if it were a dead friend. The fire had taken more than his barn. It had taken his future. Rose listened. She heard the loss, but she also heard the man. A man who didn't want to fight, but to build. A man who dreamed of apples, not of empires. The space between them was no longer empty. It was filled with his shared hope. She felt a powerful, undeniable pull. Not of pity, but of kinship. He was a builder, like her. Slowly, deliberately, she made a choice. She leaned over, closing the small, respectful distance. She rested her head on his shoulder. It was a simple, small movement, but it was as momentous as the stampede. Silas went rigid. He did not flinch. He did not pull away. And he did not put his arm around her. He just sat, solid as the mountain behind them, unmoving. He accepted the gesture. He let her choose. He took the weight, her weariness, her trust. They sat like that for a full minute, breathing in the cool, sage-scented air, her head on his shoulder, his presence a solid, unyielding wall. A sudden sharp shriek from the sky shattered the quiet. A shadow dropped, fast as a bullet. A huge red-tailed hawk. Its wings flared, hit the ground not 10 yards from the porch. It rose instantly, its powerful wings beating, climbing. Clutched in its talons was a long, dark, writhing shape. A bull snake, caught in the twilight. They both watched, frozen, as the hawk soared, carrying the dark, evil-looking thing away until it was just a speck against the dying light. The silence that returned was deep, profound. Rose lifted her head, her voice a whisper, full of awe. Some evil, it just gets carried away. Silas turned his head, his gaze meeting hers in the dusk. He thought of her, this woman who had brought danger and life and laughter, and who had just rested her head on his shoulder. And some good, he said, his voice rough. It knows to stay. The sound that woke her was not the shriek of the wind. This was a different night. The storm that had threatened and circled for days had finally broken, not in violence, but in a long, weary sigh of release. It was a soft, steady rain, a million gray fingers drumming on the tin roof of the lean-to. It was a sound that isolated, that cocooned. It was the sound of the world being washed clean, but it was also cold. The damp seeped through the thin walls, and Rose pulled the thin blanket tighter, her body aching with the chill and the weight of the child. She heard a soft scrape in the main room, the sound of the stove door opening, then closing. Silas was awake. A moment later, a quiet, hesitant knock came at the peeling blue door. It was so soft she barely heard it over the rain. Rose. His voice was a low murmur. I'm awake, she answered. You can come in. The door opened, letting in a rectangle of warmer, golden light from the main cabin stove. Silas stood in the doorway. He was not wearing his usual patched denim jacket. He held a thick, dark wool cloak. It was his good one, the one she had only seen him wear to town once. It looked heavy and warm. The damp's getting in here, he said, his voice gruff, as if embarrassed by the gesture. It's wool. It'll hold the heat better than that blanket. He stepped inside. The small room was suddenly full. He was a large man, and his presence, combined with the low drumming of the rain on the roof just above their heads, made the space intensely, frighteningly intimate. She sat up, pushing her loose hair back from her face. You'll be cold, she said, her voice a whisper. I've got the stove, he answered, dismissing it. He held the cloak out. She reached for it, and as she took it, her cold fingers brushed his. His hand was warm from the fire, hard as cured leather. The brief, accidental touch sent a jolt through her, a current of heat that had nothing to do with the stove. She looked at his hand, then at his face. He was looking at her, his eyes unreadable in the dim light. The rain on the roof filled the silence. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling, though not from the cold. She clutched the heavy cloak to her chest, but she didn't put it on. "Silas," she said, the name still feeling new, fragile. She placed her free hand on her own heart, over the swell of her body. It's not the damp. There's a storm in here. It feels worse than the one out there." He stood motionless, just inside her door. A man of wood and stone, rooted to the spot. He understood fences and drought and cattle. He did not understand this. He only understood the pain he saw in her eyes, a pain that mirrored the one he carried in himself. He had no words for it. He just nodded, accepting her statement as a fact, like he accepted the rain. She looked down at her hand, clutching his cloak. She had lived in fear for so long, lived with the expectation of violence, of being taken from, of being hurt. This man had only given. He had given her shelter. He had given her respect. He had given her his name to stitch onto a blanket. And now, he was giving her his warmth. She felt a sudden, powerful, terrifying surge of need, not for a savior, but for an anchor. For this one, solid, decent thing in a world that had been nothing but shifting, treacherous sand. Slowly, she took a step toward him. He did not move. He did not retreat, and he did not advance. He held his ground, letting her be the one to choose. She stopped, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. She lifted her hand, the one not holding the cloak, and placed it on his chest. She could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart through the rough cotton of his shirt. It was so calm. He looked down at her hand, then back to her face. His own breathing had become shallow. She made the choice. She took his hand, the large, calloused one that had offered the cloak, and she held it. She did not just hold it. She laced her fingers through his. He stiffened. This was the line. This was the boundary he had so carefully guarded. She saw the question in his eyes, the sudden tension in his jaw. She was the one who had to speak, to cross the last, final distance. She pulled, a gentle but unmistakable pressure, drawing him closer. His voice was a strained whisper, rough with a conflict she could not name. "Rose, are you sure?" It was the question she had never been asked, not by Cass, not by anyone. The fact that he asked it was the only answer she needed. She did not trust her voice. She just nodded. Once. A slow, deliberate confirmation. Yes. He took a breath, a long, shuddering intake of air. He did not move. He was still giving her the chance to flee, to change her mind. She leaned in, closing the last few inches, and rose on her toes. Lifting her face, it was the final signal. He moved, but not in a rush. He moved with the slow, deliberate care he used to mend his saddle. His other hand, his good one, came up. Not to grab, not to take, but to rest on her cheek. His palm was warm, his fingers gentle. His thumb stroked the skin just below her eye, a touch as light as a moth's wing. He leaned down. The kiss was slow. It was not the fiery, demanding kiss of her memory. It was warm and hesitant and brief. It was a question, a press of lips, chapped and tasting faintly of wood smoke in the cold night air. He pulled back, just an inch, his eyes searching hers in the dim light. She let out a breath, a sound that was almost a sob, a sound of release, and she leaned into him, her hand still holding his, her other hand coming up to rest on his shoulder. It was her second, final answer. He kissed her again, and this time, it was long. It was the warmth of the stove, the steadiness of the rain, the solidness of the earth. It was a kiss of profound, desperate, unspoken comfort. It was a thaw. It was the feeling of a long, terrible winter finally breaking. Their breath mingled, warm in the cold air. His lips were gentle, but firm, and she felt the tension in her shoulders, the fear she had carried for a year, finally begin to unknot. The heavy wool cloak, the one she was still clutching, slipped from her grasp, falling from her shoulder. It slid, a slow, dark whisper of wool, pooling at her feet. His hand, the one that had held the cloak, was free. He moved it, placing it on her back, low, supportive. It was not a hand that grasped or demanded. It was a hand that held, that steadied her. He drew her closer, not crushing her, but simply closing the space, his arm encircling her, holding her securely against him. She trembled in his arms. The sudden, violent memory of other hands, other nights, of a silver ring and a cruel voice, flashed through her. It was an involuntary, terrified reflex. He felt it instantly, the small, violent shudder that ran through her. He stopped. He did not pull away, but his kiss softened, and then he pulled back, just enough to look her in the eyes. His own were dark, filled with a deep, aching understanding. He saw her fear. He knew, without knowing, what she was remembering. His voice was a low murmur, a sound just for her, barely louder than the drumming rain. "I'm here, Rose!" He held her gaze, forcing her to see him, to see this room, this night. "I'm right here," he whispered, his hand rubbing a slow, comforting circle on her back. "You're safe." He repeated it, a vow. "I am here." He watched the terror recede from her eyes, replaced by a slow, dawning, fragile trust. He did not kiss her lips again. He bent his head and pressed a long, warm, protective kiss to her forehead. He just held her, his arms a fortress, his heart beating its slow, steady rhythm against hers. She let her head rest on his chest, closing her eyes, breathing in the scent of him, of safety. The rain fell, a steady, peaceful curtain of sound, enclosing the small room, hiding it from the world. After a long time, Silas reached out, his hand finding the small metal knob on the side of the hurricane lamp. He turned it, slowly. The flame sank, the light turning from a bright, revealing circle to a low, soft, golden glow, casting the room in deep, gentle shadows. The cabin was quiet, save for the sound of the rain on the roof and the slow, steady rhythm of two hearts, finally beating in peace. The light that woke them was a pale, watery gray. The rain had stopped, leaving the world scoured and dripping, every surface slick with moisture. The drumming on the roof was gone, replaced by a profound, echoing silence. Inside the cabin, the air was warm. Silas had already rebuilt the fire in the cook stove, and the smell of fresh, boiling coffee cut through the scent of wet wood and old ash. Rose emerged from the small room, her bare feet silent on the plank floor. She had slept in her clothes, but she felt as if she had not slept in a year. She clutched the heavy wool cloak, his cloak around her. Silas was at the stove, his back to her. He did not turn, but his shoulders, she saw, were no longer hunched in that permanent brace against the world. He seemed, for the first time, at rest in his own home. "Coffee's hot," he said, his voice a low rumble, just as it had been last night. She nodded, though he could not see her. She moved to the table, her heart a fragile, unsteady thing. The night before had been a quiet, profound revolution. It was a line crossed, a foundation laid. She was terrified of the daylight, afraid it would expose the fragile newness of what had passed between them as a mistake, a fantasy born of rain and fear. He turned, a tin cup of coffee in each hand. He placed one in front of her. His hand, the calloused one that had held her cheek, rested on the table for a moment near hers. He looked at her, his gray eyes clear, and in them she saw no regret, only a deep, steady calm. He was here. The spell was broken by a sharp, heavy knock on the door. They both froze. It was not a neighbor's knock. It was hard, official. Silas's calm vanished. The man of stone was back in an instant. He moved to the door, his hand dropping to the axe handle that always leaned nearby. "Who is it?" "It's Pike." The voice came, muffled. "Sheriff Pike, I need to talk to you. Silas, to both of you." Silas looked at Rose, a question in his eyes. He slid the bar open. Sheriff Ephraim Pike stood on the porch, his hat in his hand. his slicker dripping onto the steps. He looked tired, older than he had a few days ago. He was not alone. The widow Jensen's eldest son, Tom, stood behind him, looking nervous. "Morning, Sheriff," Silas said, his voice guarded. He did not step aside. "This isn't a social call. Silas," Pike said grimly. "I was up on Chalk Bluff at first light, where you said she saw the rider. I went to look for sign, and—" Silas's voice was tight. "And I found it." Pike said. He looked past Silas, at Rose, who was standing by the table, clutching the cup. "Tom here found it. Actually, he's got better eyes." Pike reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small, muddy object and held it in his open palm. It was a ring, heavy, silver, and caked with the dark, sticky mud of the ridge, even through the grime. The design was unmistakable, a raised, black-enameled ace of spades. The coffee cup slipped from Rose's hand. It hit the wooden floor with a loud, hollow clatter, spattering the boards. She made a sound, a small, choked gasp, as if all the air had been punched from her lungs. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide, locked on the thing in Pike's hand. Silas saw her reaction. He looked from her bone-white face to the ring, and a terrible, cold dread began to seep into his blood. Pike's gaze sharpened. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You've seen this before." Rose couldn't speak. She just stared, her entire body shaking. "It's his," she whispered, the words so low they were barely audible. "It's his." Pike stepped inside. Tom Jensen crowding the doorway behind him, his eyes wide. "I figured as much," Pike said. "Found it near a set of horse tracks and a fresh boot print. Not 20 yards from the overlook. He must have lost it in the dark, pulling his glove on." The sheriff turned the ring over in his palm. "There's initials scratched on the inside, C.M. The name hung in the air. A death sentence. "Cass Morgan," Rose said, her voice flat. "Dead." Silas turned, his face a mask of disbelief. He looked at her. "Rose, the one you fled." Pike looked confused. "The gambler the loggers mentioned, the one who, the last terrible piece of the puzzle slid into place." Silas remembered the conversation in Feeney's store, the ledger, C. Morgan. He had assumed, he had never. He looked at Rose, his voice a raw whisper. "The fire! Rose, the fire!" She met his gaze, and the tears that she had held back for months, for a year, finally broke. They streamed down her face, but she did not sob. She just let them fall. "Yes," she said. The word was a complete, agonizing confession. "His name is Cass Morgan. He is my legal husband." The silence in the cabin was absolute, broken only by the drip of water from Pike's coat. Silas did not move. He did not breathe. He just stared at her. The woman he had held last night. The woman who had laughed on his horse. The woman who had stitched his name onto a blanket for a child that was not his. She was the wife of the man who had burned his world to the ground. "He was a gambler," she said, the words rushing out now, tumbling over each other. "He lost everything. Our farm. Everything. He became a man for hire. He took money from anyone. He came here. He was working for Rusk. He was the one who burned your barn last spring. I didn't know. Not for sure. Not until I saw the name in Feeney's ledger. And I was a coward. I was so afraid. Afraid you would send me away. And last night," she choked on the word, her hand covering her mouth. "Oh, God, Silas, I am so sorry." Silas said nothing. His face was a blank, carved from pale stone. The warmth of the morning, the peace of the night before, was gone, replaced by an Arctic cold. She saw the rage come into his eyes. It was not a hot, flashing fire. It was a slow, terrifying gathering of pressure, like embers in a high wind, glowing brighter, hotter, just before they explode. He made a fist, his good hand clenching so hard his knuckles turned white. He looked at her, at the tears on her face, at the cloak his cloak she clutched. And then he turned his back on her, He walked to the far wall of the cabin, placed both hands flat against the rough-hewn logs, and lowered his head. His shoulders, which had been so at rest, were now rigid, locked. He was breathing hard, deep, shuddering breaths, fighting for control. He was a man holding onto the wooden walls of his home to keep from tearing his own world apart. The betrayal was not her past. It was the silence. It was the lie. It was the night before, a night he had seen as a new beginning, which she had known was built on the ashes of his past. Rose saw his back, a solid, unmoving wall of rejection. It was over. She had destroyed the one safe place she had ever known. "I'll go," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'll pack. I won't be here. I'll go to the church. Tamsin will. Silas, I'll go. I'll leave you in peace." Pike cleared his throat, his expression grim. "Ma'am, it ain't that simple." Silas turned, slowly. His face was pale. His eyes were still burning, but the fire was under control. It was banked, cold, and deadly. He looked at Rose, at the devastation in her face. "The guilty one leaves. Rose," he said, his voice raw. "Not you. This is your home." Pike held up the ring. "This is good. This is what I needed." "But Rusk knows it's gone. One of his men was in my office this morning, asking if anyone had found a lost item of value up on the bluff. They're spooked. And Rusk is accelerating his plan." "What plan?" Silas said, his attention snapping to the sheriff. "It ain't just about the water anymore." "Silas," Pike said, his voice low, "it's about her. Rusk is a smart bastard. He's not just a thug, he's a legalist. He knows this territory's laws are a twisted mess. A wife, especially one who's run off, is property, plain and simple." Rose's blood ran cold. "Property. Rusk can't get a lien on your land for a fake debt." Pike continued. "So he's taking another route. He's using the law. He's setting up a marital dispute. He's going to use Cass Morgan to get a legal claim on you, ma'am." He can't," Rose stammered. "He can," Pike said, his face hard. "And he is. The plan is already in motion. Cass Morgan is in town. He's been at the Tin Comet since sunup." Silas took a step forward. "He's here." "He is," Pike said, nodding. "He's loud. He's buying drinks. He's flashing a fat roll of Rusk's gold. And he's waving a piece of paper, a marriage certificate. He's telling anyone who'll listen a sob story about how his poor, confused, pregnant wife wandered off, and how a lonely, unscrupulous homesteader took her in and is holding her against her will. He's painting you as a seducer. Silas, a criminal." The raw, methodical cruelty of it hung in the air. Rusk wasn't just trying to drive Silas off. He was trying to destroy his name, his home, and his life, all at once. He's threatening to file a suit against you, Silas, for alienation of affection. He's going to get a writ from a judge Rusk owns, demanding the return of his property. That means Rose and the child. "He won't take her," Silas said, his voice a low, lethal promise. "He sets one foot on this property, I'll put him in the ground." "And that's exactly what Rusk wants," Pike snapped, his patience breaking. "Don't you see? Son, you're trapped. You kill him. You hang for murder. You beat him. You go to jail for assault, and Rusk's lawyer steps in and seizes the land for damages. You lose. Rusk wins." Pike looked at Rose, his face full of a weary pity. "The law here is a razor's edge. This ring," he held it up, "is proof he was on the bluff. It's not proof he threw the firebrand. It's not proof he burned your barn last year. It's his word and his marriage certificate against yours. And in this territory, a legal marriage contract is stronger than my badge. If he comes here with a writ, Silas, I'm not sure I can legally stop him from taking her." The trap was sprung. It was perfect. Rose was the weapon, the legal lever that Rusk would use to pry Silas from his land. She looked at Silas. She saw the rage in his eyes, but underneath it, she saw the terrible, agonizing truth. He was trapped. He was a good man, a lawful man, and the law was being used to strangle him. She had been running her whole life. She had run from Cass. She had run from the truth. She had run from this very moment. But in this cabin, in this man's arms, she had found something to stop for. She had found something and someone worth fighting for. She straightened her spine. The hunted look was gone, replaced by a cold, clear resolve. "I'm not running," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the room. Silas turned to her. "Rose, you're staying here. I'll fortify the cabin. He won't get in." "No," she said, shaking her head. She met his gaze, her own as steady as his. "He'll just wait. He'll starve us out. He'll get his writ. He's using me as a weapon to destroy you. He thinks I'm still his property. He thinks I'm a thing to be claimed." She let the cloak, his cloak, slip from her shoulders onto the chair. She stood before them, a pregnant woman in a worn dress, but she had never been more powerful. "I am not a thing," she said. "I am not property, and I am not running." She turned to Sheriff Pike, her eyes blazing with a cold fire that matched Silas's. "You said he's in town, at the saloon. Take me to him. Take me to my husband." The night was a void. There was no moon, not even a sliver, and the stars were smothered by a high, thin blanket of unseen cloud. It was a suffocating, breathless dark, in the hollow of Dry Willow Draw. The air, which had been still for days, began to move. It shifted, turning on itself, and then, as if summoned, a cold wind began to push its way down from the high peaks, blowing steadily toward the homestead. Lyle Trencher moved through the shadows like a coyote, his boots silent on the damp earth. He was done with warnings. Rusk was done with subtleties. The plan was simple: burn them out, force the signature on the bill of sale Rusk's lawyer had drawn up, and if the woman and the homesteader were inside, the fire would be blamed on the wind. He carried a 5-gallon tin of the same pine oil that had destroyed the barn. He crept to the new, small shed the one Silas and Rose had built with their own hands. It was pathetic, but it was where they kept their hay, their grain, their single horse. It was their livelihood. He uncorked the tin. The sharp, chemical reek of turpentine cut the air. He began to pour it, splashing it high on the dry wooden poles, soaking the small stack of hay inside. Inside the cabin, Rose was awake. The child was heavy, pressing on her, making sleep a restless, shallow thing. She sat up in the small, dark room, her hand on the peeling blue door. The cabin was quiet, but the air was wrong. The wind had changed, and it was carrying something. She stood, her bare feet cold on the floorboards, and went to the main room. Silas was not in his bedroll. He was by the window, a dark shape, rifle in hand. He had been waiting, too. Then she smelled it, through the chinks in the logs, carried on the new wind, the scent of pine oil, the smell of her husband, the smell of the fire. "Silas," she whispered. He had already smelled it. "He's here." Rose did not hesitate. She did not panic. She lunged for the door, threw it open, and grabbed the iron striker for the alarm bell. She began to hammer it, not in the frantic rhythm of the stampede, but a hard, steady, defiant clang. Clang, clang, clang. A signal, an alarm, a call to arms. "Lyle!" Silas roared, bursting from the cabin, his rifle leveled. "Drop it!" From the darkness, Trencher cursed. He fumbled for his matches, but it was too late. Lights were appearing. A lantern from the Jensen place, 2 more from the creek. Sheriff Pike, Silas's neighbor, and 2 other men, all armed, burst from the shadows of the creek bed where they had been lying in wait. Pike's warning had been heeded. It was a trap. "Drop it, Trencher!" Pike yelled. "You're surrounded." Lyle Trencher threw the tin down and raised his hands, a look of pure shock on his face. "A good plan, Sheriff." A new voice drawled, slow and arrogant, from the darkness near the ruined barn. "You brought all your friends." A match flared, illuminating a face, gaunt, handsome in a cruel, worn way, with dark eyes and a mocking smile. Cass Morgan stepped forward, the matchlight glinting on the pistol in his hand. He blew the match out. But you're all watching the wrong man, Cass said. He ignored Silas, ignored the sheriff. His eyes fixed on the cabin porch, where Rose stood frozen, silhouetted by the lamplight from inside. You've been a lot of trouble, Rose, he said, his voice soft, carrying in the night air. He raised the pistol, aiming it directly at her belly. But it's time to come home. You belong to me. No, Silas said, his voice a low, vibrating growl. He stepped sideways, away from the other men, putting himself between Cass and the porch. He had his rifle, but Cass's aim was on Rose. One shot, and she would be dead. This is between you and Rusk, Morgan, Silas said, moving slowly, deliberately, his boots crunching on the gravel. It's about the water. Leave her out of it. She is the water, Cass laughed, a short, ugly sound. His eyes were wild, glittering with a feverish light. She's the key. Rusk gets the land. I get you gone, and I get my wife back. Everyone wins. He licked his lips, his gaze fixed on Rose. Come on, Rose, don't make me hurt you. Silas kept moving, circling, drawing Cass's attention. You're a fool. He's just using you, a two-bit firebug. The taunt landed. Cass's head snapped toward Silas, his face twisting in rage. I'm her husband. Hey, he screamed, and he swung the pistol toward Silas. But Silas was already moving, backing away toward the north side of the yard, toward the dark tumble of boulders known as Miller's Notch. It was a place he knew, a narrow gap in the rocks where the wind was a constant, solid force. Cass followed him, stumbling in the dark, his rage making him clumsy. I'll kill you first. Crowl! I'll kill you, and then I'll take her. He entered the notch. The wind hit him like a physical blow, howling through the gap, tearing at his coat, making him squint. He raised his pistol, bracing himself against the rock. In the dark, Silas's hand was a blur. He wasn't reaching for a gun. He was uncoiling the lariat from his belt. You lose! Crowl! Cass yelled, leveling the gun. Silas's arm snapped forward, the rope uncoiled. A perfect, open loop. It wasn't aimed at Cass's body. It shot past him, over his arm, and Silas pulled. The loop snapped tight on Cass's wrist, the rough rope biting deep. Silas yanked, hard. Cass screamed as his arm was wrenched back, the pistol firing harmlessly into the sky before flying from his numb fingers, clattering into the rocks. Before Cass could even think, Sheriff Pike was on him, slamming him against the boulder. Cass Morgan, you're under arrest. At the same time, the Jensen boy had tackled Lyle Trencher and had him face down in the dirt, tying his hands. A slow, deliberate clapping sound came from the darkness by the road. Barton Rusk stepped into the lantern light. He was not armed. He was flanked by his lawyer, the thin man in the city suit. Rusk looked amused. A dramatic performance, Sheriff. Rusk purred, stopping a safe distance away, but entirely unnecessary and illegal. The lawyer stepped forward, holding a piece of paper. Sheriff Ephraim Pike, I am serving you with this writ, signed this evening by Judge T.S. Tolliver. It is a writ of habeas corpus, demanding the return of Rosalind Morgan to her legal husband, Cass Morgan. That man, he pointed at the struggling Cass, was here, under my advisement, to retrieve his lawful property. You, sir, he pointed at Silas, are guilty of harboring a runaway, and you, he pointed at Pike, are guilty of obstructing a legal writ. Rusk smiled, his eyes cold and dead. You see, Silas, you've lost. You assaulted a man who was acting within his rights. Sign the bill of sale for your land, and I will be generous. I will merely ask the court to assign this property to Mr. Morgan as damages. Otherwise, you will hang. It was a perfect trap. The air went silent. Pike was frozen. The writ was legal. The judge's signature was real. That's a powerful piece of paper, a new voice said. Tamsin North pushed her way through the small crowd, her medical bag in her hand. But it's based on a lie. The lawyer scoffed. And who are you, madam? I am Tamsin North, a sworn midwife of this territory, and this. She held up her own worn, leather-bound ledger. is my medical testimony. This writ claims Mr. Morgan is a fit guardian, but this ledger shows that on October 17th last, in Cheyenne, I treated Rosalind Morgan for 2 broken ribs, a hairline fracture of the jaw, and severe bruising administered by her husband in this territory. That is called abandonment by cruelty. A man who attempts to murder his wife forfeits all legal claims to her. That writ is void. Rusk's smile faltered. The lawyer's mouth opened and closed. Rose stepped forward from the porch. She was not trembling. She was radiating a cold, clear light. She held up the silver ring. "And this," she said, her voice carrying over the wind, "is the ring he was wearing when he did it. The ring he lost on Chalk Bluff when he threw fire at this house, trying to kill us all." She pointed a steady finger at the burned-out shell of the barn. "And he is the man who signed the ledger at Feeney's store, C. Morgan. He bought the turpentine that burned that barn to the ground last year, on Rusk's orders." The crowd of neighbors, the Jensens, the other men, turned as one. They looked from Rusk to the lawyer, to the struggling, cuffed Cass. Cass saw it. He saw the faces. He saw the ring. He saw Tamsin's book. The trap wasn't for Silas. It was for him. He was the one who was going to hang. "No!" he screamed, a sound of pure animal panic. He wrenched free of Pike's grasp, shoving the sheriff back. He lunged, not for a gun, but for the can of turpentine Lyle had dropped. "If I'm burning, you're all burning!" he shrieked. He grabbed the can, yanking the cork, and in his madness, he sloshed the volatile liquid at the new shed. Splashing it over his own clothes, he fumbled in his pocket, pulling out a lucifer match. "Cass, no!" Rose screamed. He struck the match on the rock. The wind howled. He shielded the small flame with his body, and he threw it. The wind from Miller's Notch, the wind that had saved Silas, gave its final judgment. It caught the match in midair. It did not blow it out. It blew it straight back. A tiny, fiery arrow. The ember landed on Cass's chest, on his turpentine-soaked vest. It was not a fire. It was an eruption. A blue-white whoosh that enveloped him instantly. He screamed, a sound that was not human. He was a pillar of fire, beating at himself, his face a mask of agony. He stumbled, blind, and fell backward, rolling, disappearing into the dark. Muddy irrigation ditch that ran from the willow spring. A loud, final hiss. The fire was gone. There was only the sound of the wind and the smell of burnt oil and wet wool and the low, terrible, sobbing moans from the ditch. Sheriff Pike, his face pale and sick, walked to the edge. Cass was alive, curled in the mud and water, his clothes fused to his skin, horribly burned. Pike pulled out his second set of cuffs. "Cass Morgan," he said, his voice void of all pity. "You are under arrest for attempted murder and arson." Barton Rusk was white as a sheet. His lawyer was already backing away, stuffing papers into his briefcase. This changes nothing. We will be leaving." Rusk turned for his horse. "You're not leaving." "Rusk." Silas's voice was quiet. He stepped in front of the cattle baron. Then the Jensen boy stepped up beside him. Then Tamsin North. Then the other men. They formed a silent, solid wall, blocking the path to the road. "What is this?" the lawyer stammered. "You cannot detain us." "This," Silas said, pulling a folded paper from his own pocket, "is a bill of sale for the Willow Spring." Rusk's eyes widened. I will not be threatened." "You will sign it," Silas said. "It's not a sale. It's a relinquishment. You are signing away all claims, all debts, all writs, against this property and its water. You are signing it, or these good, law-abiding citizens will bear witness that you were a co-conspirator to attempted murder." And the sheriff, he glanced at Pike, who was pointedly dragging Cass Morgan from the ditch, "is a very busy man. I don't think you'll make it to town." Rusk looked at the hard, cold faces of the homesteaders. He looked at Silas's empty hands. He looked at the smoking, moaning man in the ditch. His empire was built on fear, and for the first time, he was the one who was afraid. His hand shook as he took the pen. He signed his name, the signature a spidery scratch, Silas took the paper. He looked at it, then at Rusk. "Now get off my land." The next morning, the bell at the First Presbyterian Church rang, but it was not a call to Sunday worship. It was a summons. The town of Sagebrush Ford gathered. This was not a formal court of law, presided over by a circuit judge in a black robe. This was a territorial hearing, a frontier solution, where justice was a practical, immediate thing, hammered out by the community itself. The church was packed. The homesteaders, the Jensens, the families from the dry farms, the very people Rusk had been squeezing, filled the rough-hewn wooden yews. Their faces were hard, silent, and watchful. At the front, by the simple wooden pulpit, Sheriff Pike stood. Beside him sat Pastor Davies, a thin, serious man who held a pen and a blank ledger. This was the town's record. In the front pew sat Tamsin North, her medical bag at her feet. Beside her sat Rose, and beside Rose, his shoulders stiff but his presence a fortress, sat Silas. In a pew across the aisle, alone, sat Barton Rusk and his lawyer. The lawyer looked pale, his city suit rumpled, his briefcase clutched on his lap like a shield. Rusk was attempting his usual expression of bored arrogance, but his eyes were sharp, darting, like a cornered animal. Cass Morgan was not there. He was in the locked 6-by-6-foot cell behind Pike's office, his burns bandaged, a deputy guarding the door. Pastor Davies stood and raised a hand. The low murmur of the room died instantly. "This is a hearing of the citizens of Sagebrush Ford," he announced, his voice clear and ringing. "We are here to examine the events of last night and the weeks prior, and to determine a course of action that ensures the safety and security of this community. Sheriff Pike, you will present your findings." Pike stepped forward. He did not bluster or accuse. He built a case, piece by piece. As methodically as Silas mended a fence, he placed the silver spade ring on the pulpit, found on Chalk Bluff by Tom Jensen, after the stampede. Initials C.M. He placed Old Man Feeney's ledger, open to the page. Beside it, the signature C. Morgan, for 2 gallons of pine oil dated the day before the fire that destroyed Silas Crowell's barn. He placed the empty, foul-smelling tin can beside that. Found last night, at the scene of the attempted arson, the same turpentine, and this. He held up the singed, half-burned lucifer match Cass had dropped. "We have the testimony of the loggers," Pike continued, his voice hard. "Who heard Cass Morgan boast of being paid to set a fire? We have the testimony of Mr. Thomas Jensen, who saw Mr. Lyle Trencher applying the oil, and we have the confession of Mr. Trencher, who is in custody and has named his employer." A low, dangerous sound rumbled through the crowd. All eyes turned to Barton Rusk. His lawyer began to half rise, but a look from Pike and the sight of the dozen hard-faced ranchers sat him down again. "But this is not just about arson," Pike said. He looked at the front pew. "Tamsin, if you would." Tamsin North stood. She did not need to be loud. Her presence filled the room. She held up her own ledger. "This," she said, her voice clear, "is not about property. It is about human life. The writ presented by Mr. Rusk's lawyer last night, claiming Rosalind Morgan as property, was based on a lie." She opened her book. "On October 17th, in Cheyenne, I treated Rosalind Morgan. She had been beaten so severely I feared for her life, and the life of her child. Her injuries, which I have documented, included 2 fractured ribs and a broken jaw. They were inflicted by her husband, Cass Morgan. In the eyes of God and the law of this territory, that is not marriage. That is abandonment by cruelty. That is attempted murder. The marriage contract is null." She looked directly at Rusk's lawyer. "The writ is void. Any claim he has is void. She is, and has been, a free woman, under the protection of this community." She sat. The silence in the church was profound. Rose felt Silas's hand, beside her on the pew, unclench. "Finally," Pike said, "we have the writ itself. An attempt to use a fraudulent, voided marriage certificate to lay claim to a free citizen, all as part of a conspiracy to seize the land and water rights of Silas Crowell." He turned, his gaze like iron. and stared at Barton Rusk. "The community has seen the evidence. Pastor, if you would record the findings." Pastor Davies stood, dipping his pen. "The findings are as follows. Cass Morgan will be transported on the morning stage to the county jail in Denver to be tried by the district court for 2 counts of arson, attempted murder, and spousal battery, the marriage contract between him and Rosalind Avery. He used her maiden name, is declared suspended, and a petition for its permanent dissolution, on grounds of extreme violence, will be attached." He paused, then looked at Rusk. "Mr. Barton Rusk, for your part in this conspiracy for threatening a citizen, for hiring men to commit violence, and for attempting to defraud this community, you are fined heavily." The lawyer leaped to his feet. "You have no authority. This is not a court. It is the authority of the people whose lives you tried to destroy." Pike's voice cut like a whip. "And you will pay it. The fine will be $1,000, not to the territory, but to Silas Crowell as restitution, so he may rebuild the barn that you, through your agent, burned to the ground." A gasp went through the room. $1,000 was a fortune. It was ruin. "Furthermore," the pastor continued, his voice cold, "the assembled ranchers and landowners of this valley declare that all grazing leases held by you on the lands adjoining the Willow Spring are hereby revoked. You will have 10 days to remove your cattle. Your presence will not be welcome in this valley for a period of 10 years. It was done. Rusk's power, built on fear and paper, was broken. He was banished. His face was the color of ash. He stared, not at Pike, but at Silas. Silas just looked back, his face unreadable. The pastor closed his ledger. "This hearing is concluded." The townspeople stood. They did not cheer. There was no celebration. It was a somber, profound victory. They filed out, past Rusk and his lawyer, who sat frozen in the pew, a pariah in his own kingdom, the ranchers, one by one. Stopped by Silas's pew, they did not say much. A hand on his shoulder, a nod to Rose. "Good day, Silas." "Ma'am?" It was an anointing. It was acceptance. Silas and Rose walked out of the church into the bright, clean morning. The air felt new, light. They walked back to the homestead, the 2 miles passing in a silence that was no longer charged with secrets, but filled with a quiet, exhausted peace. When they arrived, the yard was just a yard. The smell of pine oil was gone, washed away by the night. The terrible, clawing presence of Cass Morgan, of Rusk, of the past, had been scrubbed from the air. Rose stopped on the porch. Silas walked past her. He did not go inside. He walked to the new small shed they had built and took a shovel. He went to the gatepost, the one that had been scarred by Lyle Trencher's knife, the one that had held the threatening note. He began to dig, his good arm pushing the shovel into the soft earth next to the post. He was going to replace it. He was cutting out the last piece of the violation. Rose watched him. She watched the steady, rhythmic movement of his shoulders, the solid, dependable act of work, and the tension that she had held in her body for a year. A knot of fear so tight it had become a part of her. Finally, "Let go." She began to shake. It started in her knees, a violent, uncontrollable tremor. It moved up her body, a wave of pure, physical release. The past was gone. It was not just held at bay. It was not just delayed. It was gone. Cass was gone. Rusk was gone. The threat was gone. She put a hand on the cabin wall to steady herself. She was free. She walked out to him, her legs unsteady. He stopped digging, his shovel resting on the earth, and looked at her, his face damp with sweat. It's over," she whispered, the words thick, her voice shaking as much as her body. I don't owe him anything. There are no more debts. There's nothing tying me to that." Silas looked at her, his gray eyes clear. He looked at the fresh, dark earth at his feet, and the new, clean post lying on the ground. "The past is gone," he said, his voice quiet, a statement of fact. He met her gaze, and the last of the anger, the coldness from the betrayal, was gone. There was only the man from the night of the rain. "Your future, Rose," he said, his voice rough. "If you want it, it's right here." She took the last 2 steps, closing the distance between them. She did not hesitate. This was not in the dark, not in the rain, not in fear. This was in the bright, unfiltered Colorado sunshine. In the middle of the yard that was theirs, she put her hands on his chest, feeling the solid, steady beat of his heart. He looked down at her, at this woman who had brought such chaos and such life. He put his good hand on her side, just at the curve of her waist, and his other hand, the one that had been bruised in the stampede, came up to rest on her shoulder. He drew her in. The kiss was not long. It was not hesitant. It was not desperate. It was solid. It was a foundation. It was a promise, a seal on a contract signed not with ink, but with survival. It was the first day. A half-mile down the road, the Jensen's wagon, carrying Tamsin North back to her own cabin, slowed. Mrs. Jensen, who had been the first to whisper, saw them. She saw the kiss. She saw the man and the woman, standing by the new dug hole in the bright sun. She didn't say a word. She just smiled, a broad, warm, genuine smile. Tamsin North saw it too, and she nodded once, her face a mask of deep, satisfied approval. Tom Jensen clicked the reins, and the wagon moved on, leaving them alone in their valley. Silas stepped back. He picked up the new post, settled it into the hole, and began to tamp the earth down around it, making it solid. He went to the old, violated post, and took down the heavy iron bell, the one Rose had rung. He hung it on the new post. He tapped it once with his knuckle. The sound rang out, high, clear, and bright in the morning air. It was not an alarm. It was not a warning. It was a cleansing. It was the sound of a new day. The High Plains winter gave way to a spring of such impossible, vibrant green that the old-timers in Sagebrush Ford spoke of it in hushed, awed tones. The Willow Spring, no longer a point of contention but the recognized heart of the valley, ran full and clear. The drought had broken. 2 years passed, 2 years of hard, shared labor. The restitution money from Rusk, a sum that had crippled his local power and sent him retreating to Denver, had been enough. Silas had not just rebuilt, he had built back. The first apple season came. The dream he had spoken of on the porch, the one he'd thought was dead, had been the first thing he planted, the 20 saplings he'd ordered, replacing the ones lost in the fire, had taken root with a furious, stubborn life. Now, the draw was filled with the heavy, sweet, intoxicating smell of ripe apples. Silas stood at the head of the draw, hammering a new sign into the earth by the spring head. It was made of fine, sanded pine, the letters carved deep and painted black. It did not say private property. It did not say keep out. It said Willow Spring. To live is to keep. He kept the land, he kept the water, and he kept his family. He turned, the hammer in his hand, and looked back toward the homestead. It was no longer a small, defiant cabin. It was the heart of a thriving ranch. The sound that defined their new life was not the wind, or the bell, or the crack of a rifle. It was the sound of a child's laugh, sharp and clear as the spring water itself. Hollis. They had named him Hollis, after the wind that blew through the thistles in the valley. He had been born not in fear and cold, but in the dead of a peaceful night, in the cabin that had become a home. Tamsin North had been there, her hands, which had once examined Rose for broken bones, now steady and gentle as they brought new life into the world. Silas had not been inside. He had stood on the porch, his back to the door, listening to the agonizing, life-changing sounds within. Sheriff Pike had been there too. He hadn't come as an officer of the law, but as a neighbor. He sat on the porch step, a box of fresh carpentry nails beside him, and in the long, tense hours of the night, he had, with quiet, methodical taps, hammered a new, solid door for the cabin. He had been mending the violation, tap by tap, while new life began inside, when the first thin, furious cry of the baby cut the night. Pike had stopped hammering. He and Silas had looked at each other in the lantern light, and the sheriff had given one slow, profound nod. That night was a memory now, as solid as the new door. Later, in the deep, shared quiet of the cabin, Hollis slept in the cradle Silas had carved from a single piece of cottonwood. The cabin was dark, save for the low, banked glow of the stove and a square of pale moonlight on the floor. Rose stood by the window, looking out at the land that was hers. She heard Silas move, the soft scuff of his bare feet. He came to stand behind her. He did not touch her, not at first. He just shared the view. "He's asleep," she whispered. "Good," Silas rumbled, his voice low, close to her ear. "He sleeps hard, like you." She smiled, leaning her head back against his chest. "He builds, like you." Silas's arms came around her, his hands resting on the swell of her belly, which was no longer heavy with child. His hands were warm, calloused, and safe. They held her with a familiar, easy possession that had no part of ownership, and every part of belonging. "The porch," he whispered, his chin resting on the top of her head. "I'll use the timber from the Jensens. We can extend it, all the way to the corner. Give him a place to run in the shade. And the cradle is getting small," she murmured, her own hands coming up to cover his. "He's going to need a real bed soon." He just hummed, a low sound of agreement. He turned her, slowly, to face him. In the moonlight, his face was no longer the harsh, worn mask of the man she had met. The lines around his eyes were softer, his mouth at rest. She lifted her hand, tracing the line of his jaw. He was her choice. He leaned down, and she met him halfway. Their foreheads touched, a familiar, silent greeting. They stood like that for a long moment, just breathing, a shared quiet rhythm. He was the anchor. She was the harbor. When he kissed her, it was with the deep, soft, unhurried confidence of a man who is home. It was a kiss that held no questions, no fear, and no memory of the past. It was a kiss about the porch they would build, and the bed they would share, and the long, quiet, steady years ahead. She melted into him, her heart, once a panicked bird, beating slow and steady against his, on the main support beam of the cabin, the one above the hearth. Silas had taken his knife and carved the words. It was the first thing visitors saw. It was their covenant, not by blood, by choice. The change had spread beyond their fence line. In Sagebrush Ford, the Tin Comet had a new, painted sign behind the bar. It was not a joke. The bartender, a man who had seen rusks fall, enforced it with a wooden bung starter. It read, "No credit, no vulgarity. Any man who insults a lady or a woman with child buys his drink elsewhere." The community that had gathered in the church, that had stood as a wall against Barton Rusk, did not disperse. The $1,000 had been a start, but the true payment came in sweat and timber. One morning, a month after the hearing, Silas and Rose had woken to the sound of hammers. A dozen wagons were in their yard. The Jensen boys, the men from the dry farms, even old fussy Mr. Feeney were there, armed with saws, axes, and plans. Sheriff Pike was directing them, his hat on the back of his head. "A barn is a community thing. Crowl," Pike had said, grinning, as Silas stood speechless. "You can't build it alone." They worked for a week. A barn raising. Tamsin North and the other wives had brought food, turning the homestead into a festival. It was a celebration of defiance. They were not just building a barn, they were erasing the scar. It was wide and strong, with a deep loft for the hay. And when it was done, the Jensen boys brought out a can of paint. They painted the wide main doors. They painted them a bright, clear, defiant blue, the exact same color as the peeling, scarred door that had once been Rose's only sanctuary. The old wounds had been turned into strengths. Rose, who had arrived as a hunted, illiterate woman, was now the valley's teacher. She had started an afternoon school in the new, warm barn. She taught the immigrant children from the mining camps and the orphans from the church how to read and write. Silas had built the desks. He made 3 of them, solid and smooth, from the same pine as his sign. and in the corner of each one, he had carved a single, small, perfect willow leaf. The past was not forgotten. It was simply put in its place. On the mantel, in the cabin, next to the clock, sat a small, clear glass jar. Inside it, resting on a bed of cotton, was a heavy silver ring, tarnished and dark, the ace of spades still visible. It was the CM ring. Pike had given it to them. Evidence, he'd called it. It was not hidden. It was not a source of shame or fear. It was a reminder of a debt that had been paid, of a ghost that had been laid to rest. It was just a thing in a jar, powerless, while outside, the real world, the world they had built, thrived. The sun was setting on Dry Willow Draw. A cool breeze came down from the peaks, carrying the sweet, sharp scent of apples and the smell of wood smoke from the cabin chimney. The new, bright sound of the barn bell rang, calling Silas in for supper. From the porch, a small, bright laugh echoed. As Rose swung Hollis in the air, the revenge was complete, settled not by a bullet, but by the quiet, steady weight of community and the unbending power of the law. The love was kept, secured not by a lock, but by a roof, and by a hand that had, in the darkest night, refused to let go. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Let's connect in the comments and share your thoughts. Please subscribe to the Wild West Stories 1850 channel, like this video, and give it some extra support by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by more folks.